למען ציון לא אחשה, ולמען ירושלים לא אשקוט.
You are listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemia Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemia's ministry, Makor Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiaswall.com.
Shalom, this is Nehemia Gordon with Hebrew Voices, and I am here at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem with Professor Emanuel Tov, who in my humble opinion is the foremost scholar in the world in the field of the Dead Sea Scrolls and what's called textual criticism. In fact, he wrote the book called Textual Criticism of the Hebrew Bible, which is used as a textbook in universities around the world when people study textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible, of what Christians call the Old Testament. And I was looking at his CV, his list of accomplishments, and it's unbelievable. He's worked in the past on something like 26 projects. Each one of those, and any scholar around the world would be extremely proud to lay claim to. And I'm just going to mention a few of them. And he was the editor-in-chief of the Dead Sea Scrolls publication project beginning in 1990. And my small connection to the Dead Sea Scrolls was as Emanuel Tov's assistant many years ago. I was his humble student and assistant, and I'm very proud of that. He's the co-director of the Computer Assistant Tools for the Septuagint Studies, the co-director for many years of the Hebrew University Bible Project, and that is just a small number of the things that he's done. He's presently the co-director of a series called The Textual History of the Bible. It's like a 2,000-page encyclopedia. He's a senior scholar in the Green Scholars Initiative. Emanuel, shalom. I'm very honored to be here with you and talk today about the text of the Bible.
Well, it's a pleasure, Nehemia, to be with you again.
Again, after many years.
Some time. And you make me very humble when I listen to you mentioning these achievements. It's a pleasure being with you.
Tell us about some of the things that you're doing today.
Well, today I'm retired, and I'm in a very special position because even though I'm retired, I still do teach. And basically, I continue working, and I'm still involved in several projects. I edit Dead Sea Scroll fragments, some of them personally, but mostly I oversee the work of others. So I have a small team of people who, for the Green Scholars Initiative, publish 13 small fragments, really small.
Yeah.
2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines.
But even those are important in studying the Dead Sea Scrolls.
They are important, as all fragments are important. Yeah. And they've come to the market, say, 1919, 2000. And these particular fragments will be published in the year 2016.
Now, wait a minute. You're talking about publishing fragments. Are you telling us that today, in 2015, there are unpublished fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls after all these years?
Yes, after all these years.
And you're overseeing the publication of some of those fragments.
That's correct.
Wow.
And I'm not the only one, because there's 2 or 3 other groups in the world, one in Norway and 2 other ones in the United States of America, where simply organizations or rich people have bought these fragments. They were on the market, and in fact, if you or anyone has a few pennies to spare, a few millions.
Is it really pennies? Oh, millions. Okay.
There's a few millions to spare. Then I can arrange it for you to buy.
You heard it here. He could arrange for you to buy actual Dead Sea Scrolls. And so how did they get onto the market?
Well,
in other words, the original Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in a cave at Qumran, and then the archaeologists went and they excavated and found more scrolls, the 11 caves at Qumran, and then approximately 8 other sites around the Judean desert, in addition to Qumran. So how is it these appeared on the antiquities market?
Well, these, I can't say they are secrets, but I don't know. Some of these were probably illegally held back.
But we don't know that for a fact.
No, we don't know these things. But they were dug up, and then they somehow did not get to the people who were supposed to get them in 1948 or 50. We don't know these things.
And what you're saying is that there are benefactors, if we can call them that, who have bought these scrolls and said, you know what, I don't just want this to sit in my living room in a display case, I want it to be published.
Oh, yes, these are good people.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Who do this for the sake of scholarship.
That is great. So right now you're working on 13 fragments. So look, I know some of my listeners out there, they're into conspiracy theories and things like that. So are these unpublished scrolls because there's something in them like the Vatican is covering them up or something like that? You've probably heard these stories. So I'm just going to officially ask you, is there some kind of grand conspiracy that's preventing these final scrolls from being published?
Ever since I started with my work on the Dead Sea Scrolls, I've heard these stories. They're all nonsense. I say nonsense about conspiracies. This basically started, I would say, about 1950 already, maybe
Really?
1960.
That early, the conspiracies?
That early. My view of this is that I think that certain people were disappointed in the 1950s
Yeah.
that Jesus' name was not found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there were such high expectations that such an enormous amount of scrolls would not have the mentioning of Jesus in those scrolls coming from the same area. So that theories developed that the Vatican did not want certain theories to be aired. Because there could be a bad press for Jesus, that they said, well, the Vatican confiscated or burned certain scrolls. Now, this has been in the press for a long time, and all bona fide scholars say this is pure nonsense, including all Catholic scholars who are close to the Vatican. So, until today, there's no one who takes these claims theory, and they started with John Allegro.
Okay.
Who is
who is he, for those who don't know?
The enfant terrible of the Dead Sea Scroll.
Well, that was in French. Some of my listeners might not know what that is. What was he?
He was the enfant terrible, the naughty boy.
Okay, so you know what? Let's move on past that. but that wasn't because of some kind of agenda to cover something up. It might have been because he had some personal issues or something like that.
He did have some personal
All right,
issues.
let's not deal with that. But it wasn't some Vatican conspiracy. And, you know, I could give my own testimony here that when I was working for you as an assistant, you had me and another assistant dig through these books looking for fragments that maybe somebody forgot to publish. So not only was there no conspiracy, there was an attempt to find some little scrap of paper that maybe has a half a letter on it. Did somebody forget to publish that? I mean, it's possible that there's unpublished scrolls that just were overlooked, but it wasn't a conspiracy, right?
No. You, Nehemia, you helped us out, and you have seen with your own eyes how meticulous we were.
Meticulous is an understatement. Okay.
How meticulous we were to really do justice to the smallest piece of inscribed material. And actually, there are also people who work on uninscribed material, because even uninscribed material could have information on something.
Wow. I know you're working on a lot of projects. He has a list of 51 pages on his website, emmanueltov.info, and we pulled it up and he said, well, it's not complete. Today it's actually 53 pages. These are of his publications and projects. I'm humbled by this. And these are academic publications, each one of which is peer-reviewed and goes through this process and is amazing. So what are some of the other things that you're working on?
Well, I'm very proud of a book that I've written 11 years ago. It's called The Scribal Habits of the Fragments, the Scrolls that were found in the Dead Sea area. In that book, that's a single book that can still be bought, and that describes until the smallest details how the scribes wrote, how they made errors, how they made paragraphs, how they corrected the errors, etc. So it's a whole description of all those things that we actually today learn in schools.
Right.
And it's a handbook. It has become a handbook for all those who now...
Meaning a handbook it's a textbook. Like, this is the definitive work. If I have a question or an issue, you know, and you mentioned paragraphing, and some people are like, might be dozing off, but guys, pay attention. There are biblical passages where the interpretation hinges on, is there a space in the manuscript which indicates a new paragraph? And you went and you actually studied how this was represented in the Dead Sea Scrolls and things like that.
Yeah, I studied this for all the years that I have been editor-in-chief. And I worked with every single editor. I worked with 60 or so editors. And I sat with everyone and worked with his or her text. I made notes on the side when I learned something about a certain text. And I said, gee, that's interesting for me.
Right. And
late at night, I integrated that information into the book that eventually I published.
So we're going to post a link on my website, nehemiaswall.com, to the book. And the other book, look, if you guys want like a serious book about understanding the text of the Bible, It's called Textual Criticism of the Hebrew Bible. Like I said, they teach it in universities around the world. I've actually been working through this book the last few weeks, and I got to tell you, I was brought back all these memories of, I felt like I was a student. I'm taking pages and pages of notes, and I'm going late into the night. I don't want to put it down. It's such an amazing book. I mean, there's more information in some of these footnotes than many people who spend their lives on the Bible know. Meaning, like, there's people who spend their whole life on the Bible, and you have more information in some of your footnotes than those people know. It's amazing stuff here. I really want to recommend it. And the other book, the Scribal Habits book, I'm going to have a link for both of those books on nehemiaswall.com on my website. Are there any other projects that you're working on?
Well, I'll say a few things about this book, The Textual Criticism of the Bible.
Yeah.
This is a book that I started in 1989 in Hebrew, and from the Hebrew, it found its way into English. I translated it myself. From there into German. I did not translate that myself. Into Russian. It is now being translated into Portuguese.
Wow.
And into Korean.
Wow.
Just 2 weeks ago, it has been published in an electronic edition with Accordance Company. And the electronic edition is really something.
Yeah, tell us about
because you
that.
can do so many things that I have never been able to do with it. All kinds of very interesting searches.
Yeah.
So we had a scholarly meeting 2 weeks ago. I said, one of my principles in life is if you don't know something, write about it.
Okay. What does that mean?
That means people had a good laugh like you just did. And I really meant it. When I knew about the areas of the textual criticism of the Bible, I knew about several areas, obviously, because I started writing about it. But like the area of the Syriac Bible, I didn't know much.
That's the Aramaic Bible written by Christians in the Syriac script, for those who don't know.
Or about the Masorah, which is the medieval commentary around the Hebrew text.
The Masoretic notes you're talking about.
Yes.
Okay. The
I
scribal
didn't
notes.
know much. So
Okay.
at first I thought, I'll ask someone to do that for me. And then I thought, no, I saw it really doesn't work. It has to be part of my system. So I learned, and then I wrote about it. So that's what I meant when I say, if you don't know something, write about it.
And when you say you learned, and you don't mean you picked up somebody else's book. I mean, I think usually what you do is you do original research. Like you're talking about how there were 60 plus editors and each one was an expert on a specific text. But you got this overall picture because you were the editor-in-chief and got to deal with all the texts.
Yes, now my way of learning is I start from the beginning. If you could see my hands, you could see how I build from the beginning with the building stones, very beginning, and then make it from the basis to a large overall picture. And that's how I made my book, and it really, I'm very proud of it. It's a description of what the Hebrew text is. It is technical, and I realized one day I should write a less technical book, but it is understandable also for those who do not understand every technical detail. But it tells you what the text of the Bible is, how it has been transmitted through the different generations, what the scribes were, and what the liberties were that the scribes took when they transmitted the Bible. And if you come to a verse, like in Genesis chapter 2, Vayachal Elohim b'yom hashvi'i, that's the Masoretic text. That's a text that you know. And God finished his work on the seventh day. That's the verse you know.
Right.
And you would not expect that there are basically texts that say not that God finished his work on the seventh day, but that read God finished his work on the sixth day. Because God did not finish his work on the seventh day. Because God forbid God should work on the seventh day. The Jews are not allowed to work on the seventh day. So why should God himself work on the seventh day? So, because of this somewhat difficult reading, a secondary reading developed that said that God finished his work on the sixth day. That means on the end of the sixth day. Nevertheless, the reading in our Hebrew, French, English Bible is correct, because it really means that God finished his work something like by the seventh day. But the Greek Bible, the Samaritan Bible, the Syriac Bible have God finished his work on the sixth day. So this is an example showing to you how a theologically different reading developed long ago. You might say 2,000 years ago. It's actually probably 2,300, 2,400 years ago. And if you know these things, you know a little bit about the development of the biblical text. Now, this is a small detail, and there are many large details.
So let me just summarize. So what we have here in Genesis 2 is this verse that says, and God finished creation on the seventh day. And what you're saying is that probably sometime around 300 BC, some scribe, maybe a righteous scribe who thought he was doing the right thing, he came along and he said, we can't have God working on the Sabbath. We got to fix this. Maybe he even thought it was a mistake that he was fixing. And so what he did is he quote unquote corrected the text, making an easier reading, which is that God finished it on the sixth day, even though in the original Hebrew it probably means he finished the creation by the seventh day. And what you're saying is this exists in the Septuagint and in the Samaritan version of the Bible, but what we have preserved in the Masoretic text is probably the original reading. And this is a principle that we call in Hebrew ha-gilsa ha-kasha difa, or I think they say in Latin difficilior lectio, I may be mispronouncing that the more difficult reading is preferable. And I remember learning this and thinking, wow, wait a minute. So when I read the easy reading, that actually might be a righteous scribe who thought he was fixing it and actually corrupting the text. That's incredible concept. And this is the type of thing that you talk about in your book.
Right. And this is an example about which we can have an opinion. Mm-hmm. There are also details about which I think we cannot have an easy opinion.
Mm-hmm. In other words, this one, there's no question that was preserved in the Masoretic text and the Standard English Translation. That's the original. You're saying other ones aren't so clear-cut.
No. How tall was Goliath?
Yeah, I don't remember. How tall?
No. Well, now I'm not sure exactly what is written where, but there's one version where it says that he was 4 cubits tall, and in another version it says that he was 6 cubits tall. So one will be the Masoretic text, and the other will be a Qumran scroll, and also it will be the Septuagint. Okay. So the question is, how tall was he? 2 meters or 3 meters? Okay. How will we ever know?
Right. Okay.
How will we ever know? And there definitely is a relation between the two.
Yeah.
Either someone changed 2 meters to 3 meters.
To make it sound like it was a more impressive feat of killing him, right?
Or someone said, no, 3 meters, no, that's too much.
It's not possible.
we don't need someone who is 3 meters tall, because God is so good, he can also work with someone who's only 2 meters.
Okay.
So that's, again, a theological issue.
And the verse here is 1 Samuel 17:4 in the Masoretic text. It in fact says, he was shesh amot vazeret. I love that, vazaret. He's 6 meters and a pinky. It's very specific. And you're saying there's another version which says he's 4 meters. And there's
a Septuagint.
And the Septuagint. And one of these is someone had a theological issue to change it. And as a scholar, you have no way of knowing what the original text was, whether it was our Hebrew Bible as preserved today, or the Septuagint.
That's my view.
That's your view, okay.
Other people might say, well, the difference is simply a scribal error. And that's a very important thing in our field.
Yeah.
There's so many differences of opinion, and you can never say who is right and who is wrong. It's a slightly technical area, of course, but there is much room for human views.
There's a certain amount of textual criticism which is subjective, is what you're saying.
It is very subjective.
Okay.
This is the area that we call judgment, evaluation. The evaluation is subjective.
Okay.
Is always subjective.
I see. Okay. Very interesting. Now, one of the really interesting things I read about in your book is that there's a standard explanation that many scholars have that the text of the Bible, and we're talking here about the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, was originally very fluid, and then there was a process of stabilization, which eventually led to what we have called the Masoretic text. And you have a very different view on that. And maybe, I hope this isn't too technical. Guys, pay attention. This is actually really important. You know, we'll have, in the rabbinical literature, we'll have these discussions about the most minute letter having significance and meaning. And what you find in the Dead Sea Scrolls is things were a lot more fluid back then.
I will talk about this, but I will say to your listeners that if you don't get it exactly, this is a very difficult thing. And you may have to read my book or to read other things, because I'm going to tell you some things which are part of a much larger issue.
Listen, guys, I want you to listen to this 2 or 3 times. This is really important stuff. Please.
But basically, one of the principles is the text of the Bible is not just one text. That's a fact. That is the text that you have in your hand in Hebrew, in English, is the so-called Masoretic text. So you will have in your hands the English text, which is a modern version like the New Revised Standard Version, and all these English versions derive in some way from the King James Version, but they are all based in some way on the Masoretic Hebrew text. A little bit different readings or not, but it's the medieval text.
And for those who aren't familiar with this, basically if you walk into the bookstore in Israel or you go into somebody's home and they have a Bible in Hebrew, that's the Masoretic text.
Right.
Okay.
Now, you go back. So you have the Middle Ages, you go back to the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we go back 2,000 years. At that time, if you would walk in the streets of Jerusalem, if you would go to the community at Qumran, if you would go to any other community in ancient Israel, you would not find one text, you would find many texts. And this is a major issue for scholars to understand. So, which text would you find? Well, that's my task. And if you say, if there's anything about which Emanuel Tov think the whole day, that's the issue. I think about which text the people had in their hands in the year 200 before the Common Era, the year 100 before the Common Era, the year 0. That's what I'm thinking about.
And just to be clear, so for example, if you'd walk into the library at Qumran when it was a city or a village 2,000 years ago, and you'd open up one copy of Isaiah and another copy of Isaiah and compare them, they would not be identical. And actually, you can go to the Israel Museum today to the Shrine of the Book and see that that's a fact.
Yeah, well, all these things are facts, because you'll have the text that I call the Masoretic text is found, something like it, is found at Qumran, and actually more so in the places, or we call them sites, in the sites around Qumran, for example, on top of the Masada, places called Nahal Hever, Murbad, etc. So this is really a marvel. Maybe it's not a marvel, it's a man-made marvel, but the Masoretic text that we're using today, without vowels, mind you, is found 2,000 years ago already in the Judean desert.
Wow, so that's significant. And I think some people will call that the Proto-Masoretic text. You use the term M-like text, the Masoretic-like text. But basically what we have today in the Hebrew Bible that's in any synagogue here today in Israel, or that you get in a Hebrew bookstore, a form of that already exists 2,000 years ago. In fact, 2,250 years ago, according to what you wrote.
Right.
But you're saying in addition to the Masoretic text, there are other texts.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I can't stress enough how important it is. And you did not allow me to slam the table. I will not do that.
Because then it comes across as this boom in the recording.
How important it is.
Yeah.
I would say also for religious reasons that the Masoretic text was there already 2,100 years ago in the Judean desert.
Okay.
Now, equally important for scholars, maybe not for religious reasons, is the fact that other Hebrew texts existed in ancient Israel, in the Judean desert, at that time.
Okay.
Now, I cannot name them exactly. One of them would be the Hebrew source of the Greek translation of the Septuagint.
And that's really interesting because a lot of times we'll see the Septuagint is different from the Masoretic text. And I think the assumption of many people is, well, the Greek got it wrong. And what you have shown is that in many cases, the Greek was translating a Hebrew text which existed.
Yeah, the Greeks did not get it wrong.
Okay.
In certain books, we can clearly follow that, like in the book of Jeremiah, in the book of Deuteronomy, in the book of Samuel, we can clearly follow that translation. That is clear. So that is one source. We have the so-called Samaritan Pentateuch.
Pentateuch is the 5 books of Moses. Yeah.
That existed already in the Judean desert at that time. And then we have an endless number of scrolls in the Judean desert, mainly in Qumran, that are different from all these. So it's an endless number of texts that we know not from 500 before the Common Era, from 250 before the Common Era, until the year 0, until the year 100 of the Common Era. Now what happened? How do I see the development of these texts? It is here where scholars differ in their opinion.
So basically, up until now, this is fact. And I'm just going to throw some statistics out that I copied from your book. You've basically, I counted them as 5 families of text. You've got the Masoretic, Proto-Masoretic text or Masoretic-like texts, 55 scrolls. The pre-Samaritan texts, which is only the 5 books of Moses. It doesn't have the Samaritan theological changes about Mount Gerizim, but other than that, it's very similar to the Samaritan type of text. Another of 5 scrolls, Proto-Septuagint, 6 scrolls, meaning it's in Hebrew, but it's the source of the Septuagint. You call them unaligned, 55 scrolls. And then the QSP, which we're going to talk more about, Qumran scribal practices. I'm going to try to get him to talk about that. That's really interesting to me, 28 scrolls. And that's out of about approximately 210 scrolls of the Bible at Qumran. So that's really interesting. And then you wrote here on page 110, a textual plurality in the country as a whole. And the Qumranites paid no special attention to textual differences. All right. Wow.
From here onwards, it's all a matter of personal opinion.
Right. So this was fact, guys. You can like it or not like it, but these are facts. And now he's going to give the interpretation with his expertise.
But there are different views because certain scholars, I would say most scholars, say there has been a movement of what they call stabilization towards the Masoretic text. Now, what does stabilization mean? Is that slowly the inhabitants of ancient Israel realized that the main text of the Bible should be the Masoretic text. That is called stabilization, and that's why today we have the Masoretic text.
In other words, there were many different texts. According to many scholars, it eventually moved in the direction of just one text.
My view is somewhat different because I say the Masoretic text was always there. It is an important text, and in my view, it's a very good text. In my view, in the 5 books of Moses, and this is something new, in the 5 books of Moses, it's clearly the best text. Not in all books, but in the 5 books of Moses, definitely the best text.
And best meaning closest to the earliest form? Is that what you mean?
Closest to the earliest form, yes, indeed. But there were certain historical developments because of which the Masoretic text survived and not the other ones. To be clear, if in the year 200 before the Common Era we have all these different text forms, there were certain things that happened in the land of Israel. In the year 70, simply the temple was destroyed, there was a great chaos, and many people were killed. And the people who were at Qumran, who had all these beautiful scrolls, were killed. And there were no followers who had in their hands all these scrolls that were different from the Masoretic text. The only ones who survived the chaos of the destruction of the temple were the official representatives of Judaism, or the representatives of what became official Judaism, which is Pharisaic Judaism. And they had the Masoretic text. So there was no stabilization of the text. It was a historical accident that, because of which streams of Judaism did not continue having their text. Because, on the one hand, I said, the people in Qumran were killed. On the other hand, the people who had in their hands the Greek text, the Septuagint, they were not part of Judaism anymore.
What happened to them?
Because they became Christians.
Okay.
It's as simple as that. For one generation, the early Christians were Jews, and then they became Christians. The Samaritans, who were, they were together with the Jews for some time, but after some time they became a completely separate stream within Judaism. So
yeah, and I believe you wrote in one of your footnotes, if I'm not mistaken, that happened when John Hyrcanus destroyed their temple sometime in the 2nd century BC. And
right.
Wow. Okay.
So from that time onwards, the Samaritans, they had their own Bible text. So their texts were not within Judaism anymore. So the only ones who had the Hebrew Bible according to the Jewish belief were the rabbis, so to speak. And the rabbis had the Masoretic text. Okay. So there was in my view, no stabilization. Other people will, maybe it makes no big difference for, let's say, for the general public, because at the end, the result is the same.
Well, so here's the difference. So basically, if I understand you right, if I would go to a rabbi, or not a rabbi, a proto-rabbi, whatever existed before the rabbis in 250 BC, and I would ask him, show me your copy of the book of Genesis, his Genesis will look essentially like the Genesis in my printed Bible today.
Yes.
Whereas if I went to somebody at Qumran, and they weren't there in 250 BC, but if I went to the predecessors in 250 BC and I said, let me see your Bible, it would depend on which scroll he happened to pull out of the shelf, and each one might be different.
And if you would go to a Bible store, if there were one, in the
or a professional scribe back
in
then,
the David Street in the ancient city of Jerusalem, and if that man had in his store 4 copies of the book of Genesis, it could be 4 different copies.
Unless he was a proto-rabbi, in which case they'll probably be all
Unless he was a proto-rabbi, they would be all the same.
Now you mentioned, and I love this because this is on page 30, footnote 16. This is like amazing information. I can't emphasize this, guys. In this footnote he has on page 30 is more than many scholars in the world actually, or people who are called scholars, know. It's unbelievable, this stuff. So you talk here about how it is that in 250 BC, or whenever, that these proto-rabbis would have had, and you actually say they might be related to the Sadducees, I think you said somewhere in one of the footnotes, in the temple. How did they have this uniform form of the Bible, this one stream within Judaism, where everybody else had this plurality? How did that come about? That's fascinating to me, this information.
It is fascinating, Nehemia. But being a scholar, I should stress once again that this is all hypothesis.
Okay. But you've got some actual sources, which admittedly were written down later, that refer to these processes that would have kept the uniform text for one stream of Judaism.
In my view, I base myself on the fact that in the Judean desert, if we find 3 scrolls that are really identical, 3 scrolls of Genesis that are identical, I ask myself, basing myself only on the argument of logics, and logics is in the same in the whole world, and at any time. How could 3 scrolls be identical? They can only be identical if they are copied from the same base. And where could the same base be situated? Only in the temple.
I think there's even more than that. In other words, A, they have the same base, and B, there's a scribal practice of saying, I have to get this exact. For example, 1Q Isaiah A, which is the complete scroll you mentioned in one of the footnotes here or somewhere, that could have been copied from the temple scroll, just he didn't mind changing things. Is that right?
That's right.
Meaning there was this fluidity when he copied it, these freely copied texts that, if there's a word here that was used in ancient Hebrew, and in the Hebrew of the era in which he copied it wasn't used, maybe he'll replace it with a more common word or something like this.
At that time, or at any other time, there were simply different approaches, 2 main different approaches in ancient Israel, maybe anywhere else in the world, you could say the same. One is one of precision, and one is of not precision, of liberal approach to the text. The one of precision is the one that actually gained, that prevailed. And the approach of precision said, we all copy our text from the text that was in the temple. And we have several verses, quotations, references in the Talmud that talk about the copying from the temple scroll. But we should not forget, and that's why I say this is all hypothesis, that these verses in the Talmud, the Jewish legal late body of rabbinic exegesis, that these are late.
Right, but it may preserve earlier traditions. I know scholars love to say that. It's a late book, but it may preserve earlier traditions.
Yes.
And if people want to look that up, it's in the Babylonian Talmud Ketuvot 106a, and it says Magihim, which I guess is something like proofreaders, of books in Jerusalem received their fees from the temple fund. So there was this category of something like proofreaders who would make sure the Bible text was copied exactly. And that was one approach, this precise approach. Maybe they were a little bit autistic and they said, we've got to get it exactly right, every letter. And I know other scholars make a bigger deal of this. You kind of downplay it, I think, that there were examples where very trivial details are corrected in the direction of the Masoretic text with like a little vav added above the line. I think you kind of downplay that. But I know other scholars make a big deal about that somebody was clearly proofreading these proto-Masoretic scrolls. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, let's not confuse those matters, because later on, within the Masoretic tradition, there were many corrections of that type. But that was only within the Masoretic tradition.
Right. We're talking now about the Masoretic-like text.
Yes.
So that's what you called the precision. And that's amazing. I want to read something you wrote here. This is page 30. The temple employed professional magihim, quote, correctors, to safeguard the proper distribution and precise copies of scriptures. These scrolls must have been used everywhere in Israel for public reading as well as for instruction. And what this means is that and now I'm going to direct this to the Christian listeners, if I may. So when Jesus went into the synagogue of Nazareth, according to the Gospel of Luke, and they handed him the copy of the scroll of Isaiah, if it was a Pharisee, for example, who handed him the copy of Isaiah, then he probably read the same Isaiah that we have today, down maybe even to the letters. But if it was somebody like a Qumran person, then it may have been a little bit different.
I have often thought about this passage in Luke, and I think in my mind that the copy that Jesus had in his hand would not have been like the Isaiah scroll that is displayed in the Israel Museum, because that copy is a very faulty copy. It's a free copy.
Okay.
Many mistakes. He would have had in his hand like a Pharisee copy.
Okay.
Like 1Q Isaiah B.
Okay.
Or even more precise than that. And people should think about that, because it's very easy for the public to think, because this beautiful copy, that's not beautiful, but this complete copy in the Israel Museum might mislead people to think that that's the copy that Jesus could have had in his hand. But I don't think so. Because the rabbis would never accept that copy as a kosher copy, so as an acceptable copy, because there's too many corrections in every column. The rabbis did not accept a scroll as acceptable if there were more than 3 mistakes per column.
And in one of your notes here, somewhere in the book, you mentioned that this might not just have been the Pharisees, this might have also been the approach of the Sadducees and the temples. In other words, when we say Pharisees, it doesn't necessarily mean just the Pharisees, but there was streams within Judaism who said if we're going to read a scroll in the synagogue, it has to be one based on exactly what's written in the temple. But then there was an entirely different approach. And now let me ask you to talk about the QSP, the Qumran scribal practices, of which I think we said there were 28 scrolls of the Bible that you identified, I believe it was, that follow this really different, very liberal, free approach. What are some of the characteristics of that approach? And guys, when you go to the Israel Museum, they have on display the main scroll in the center, which, by the way, is a photograph. But the main scroll in the center there is 1Q Isaiah A. There's a real piece of it on the side, which isn't a photograph. And you're saying that is not a scroll that would have been read in public. That is something that followed these Qumran scribal practices. Tell me about these scrolls that you categorize them as QSB, the Qumran scribal practices.
There were some real surprises when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. One of the great surprises were scrolls that were written in a spelling system that is completely different from anything we knew so far. Now, what is spelling? Spelling is when you write the word night, Night. When you write that in American English like Nite, that's exactly the same.
Or maybe it's like color, COLOR versus ULOUR.
Now, we have these scrolls from Qumran, just like the large Isaiah scroll has completely wild spellings. Spellings that we would call in modern Israel completely wrong. Now, if there are people among you who know Hebrew, you know the word ki, that means because, kaf yod. And in that scroll, it's written Kaf Yod Aleph, completely wild.
Wow.
And if you have the word Zot, that means that in English, and that is written instead of Zayin Aleph Tav, could be written Zayin Vav Tav, etc. If you have the word, and that's already not spelling, but that's a form, you have the word for the English word he, which in Hebrew is who.
That's confusing, but yeah.
And in that...
Meaning he, the person he, is who in
is
Hebrew.
who,
Yeah.
yes. And that is written as hua.
Wow.
And so there's several of those cases. And these forms are probably dialectal forms. This was completely unexpected. And this shows this is a sign of the freedom of that particular scribe. Because you don't really write today a Bible with the word night, N-I-T-E, etc. It's not very honorable to do so. But at that time, they had all the honor in the world for the Bible, but they thought that you can just do that. And so there's a whole spectrum of things you can do to the Holy Bible, to the fully acceptable Bible that is read by everyone and accepted by everyone. But the concepts of what you can do with it were different at that time.
At Qumran and maybe other places, but you find that primarily at Qumran, you said. And you said that there were, manuscripts that were of the Bible found in, I think it was 25 manuscripts of the Bible found in 8 other locations. And those were all Masoretic-like texts. Whereas at Qumran, you had this specific type that was very free and liberal. So it depends who you were, basically. In other words, what you just described might have been certain people that would have done that. But again, if you would go to the temple and ask somebody, hey, show me your Bible, it wouldn't have looked like that. Or even the synagogue.
Right.
Places.
Well, our information is very limited.
Right, of course.
And there must be social-religious differences between the people in ancient Israel. So all we know, well, first of all, we think that most of the written material on scrolls, on leather and on papyrus must have perished from that period. But the little we have, and that is a lot, because from Qumran alone we have something like 230 remnants of 230 biblical scrolls. That little is still a lot, but it's only from a few places. Right. So if you would come to Qumran, you would find a library of very different texts. If you would go to Masada, there would be only one type, the Masoretic text. You would go to Nachal Chevra, it would be only one type. Now, if you would go to Jerusalem, you would find them of many types. If you would go to the temple, you would find them, in my view, only of one type. So it would depend where you would go to.
Very interesting. Now, you made the statement that it was an accident of history that this one type survived the Masoretic text, and that as a scholar, that of course that's how you look at it. I think I could make a theological statement and say, from my perspective, it's providence, but as a scholar, that's outside your purview. And look, guys, here's the facts and here's the information. Decide for yourselves. Now, you were also involved in a computer program called Accordance, which my listeners know because my friend Keith Johnson calls it the tap, tap, tap program. When we were doing these podcasts, he would say something, ask me a question, say, look up Nehemia in your Bible program. And I would go on my computer, tap, 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 and they could hear the tapping in the recording. That's Accordance. That's a program I learned about from you, that you were actually involved in designing some of the modules and creating them. So tell us about what that is. It's a really powerful tool.
Well, for me, Accordance is the very best. It's a program that was designed for the Macintosh, and since 2 years now, it's also on the PC platform.
And I have it here. I'm using Windows 10, and I have it on the PC.
Oh, great!
Yeah, right here.
This is a program that is much around the Bible, but there's many, many other things. So I won't talk about all the modules that they have for the Christian world, for the Jewish world. I'll stay close to home to my own world, which is the Bible world. And what you can do here, you can work with the Hebrew Bible text and around it in parallel columns, the Greek and the Aramaic, the 3, 4, 5 different Aramaic texts, Latin text, maybe 100 different translations. And among other things, the module that you refer to, Nehemia, is one module that I developed with my team in the 1980s.
Wow.
This was a project that I had in conjunction with the University of Pennsylvania. It was called CATS, a good Jewish name, Computer Assisted Tools for Septuagint Studies. Mm-hmm. And it was my concept of develop. It sounds like long ago, and it's a concept that was in the meantime has been followed by several other projects of having in parallel lines one word of the Hebrew and one word of a translation or of another text. So you have in the beginning, Breshit.
Meaning the words God, in the beginning, which in Hebrew is Bereshit. Yeah.
Bara, created. So it's not. It goes according to the sequence of the Hebrew. Mm-hmm. And so this is a comparison of the Hebrew and the Greek, and then together with a reconstruction of the Hebrew parent text of the Septuagint. And then, of course, you should realize that what you need for this purpose, you need morphological analysis, an analysis of all the base forms of all the Hebrew words, because the computer doesn't know that the English word went is derived from to go. So the same for the Hebrew word vayelech, the computer doesn't know that it is derived from halach. So you need all that morphological analysis for the Hebrew and for the Greek, and you can do really marvels with it. And this accompanies me day and night. And a book that has all those equivalences is called a concordance. And I don't use my concordances anymore. I can now sit in an airplane and prepare my Septuagint classes and do this. If I have a good flight from Tel Aviv to New York, I can prepare my classes pretty well.
And I can't emphasize how powerful a tool this accordance is. And in simple terms, the words in the Hebrew and in the Greek are tagged. I use this literally every day, multiple times a day. And it's funny because I remember when I was in high school and I had a paper concordance and the front cover would come off and the back cover would come off. It was used so much. And I would spend weeks trying to research what is the meaning of a certain word in biblical Hebrew based on how it's used. And the word might appear 300 times. And I have to look up one of the 300 verses in its context. And now I push on a button and I get them all on the screen. And I can compare that. How is that translated in the Aramaic? How is it translated in the Greek? It's unbelievable. It's really powerful, amazing. And you were involved in developing that. It's really impressive. I mean, people are going to be using this for generations to come, and you did it.
So you can find this somewhere under Accordance Bible software or Oak Tree Bible software. Okay. And in that program, incidentally, there's a module which has my book, The Textual History of the Bible.
Yeah, and you were saying you can do powerful things now with this electronic module.
Very powerful.
Wow, that's amazing.
And this, if you read my book, then it has hyperlinks to the biblical text in accordance.
Wow, that's pretty cool. If you want to look up a certain verse or something and see, is that verse referenced in the book, I'm assuming you can find that as well.
So that would be the other way around.
Yeah, and I'll give you an example here. So Exodus chapter 20, verse 24, one of my favorite verses where God says, in every place I will cause my name to be mentioned, there I will come and I will bless you. And you talk about that on page 88, how that's slightly different in the Samaritan version. And so if you were doing research on that verse, you could plug in Exodus 20:24, and it will pop up, yes, that appears in Emanuel Tov's book page, and it'll bring it to you.
That I don't know. That you would probably, I think that's possible.
Yeah.
But that would be called a note within accordance, and that would have to be prepared. Mm-hmm. That I don't know.
Well, so for example, I know like in the Gesenius module, which I have, so I can look up a verse, and if that verse is in there, you can search by English content, by Hebrew content, by what they call scripture, meaning a reference like Exodus 20:24.
Yeah.
So I'd be surprised if you can't do that in there. Anyway, there's amazing, powerful things you can do. It's been a real honor to talk to you, Professor Tov. This has been an amazing, fascinating discussion. And I just want to remind people you have the book Textual Criticism of the Hebrew Bible. Another book is the scribal practices and approaches reflected in the text found in the Judean desert. These are actual textbooks that people use in universities, but a layman can read them too. You probably need to put a little bit more effort if you're a layman to read it a few times. It's really powerful stuff. I'm going to have a link for both of those books on nehemiaswall.com on my website. Guys, his website is emmanueltov.info. I'll have a link on nehemiaswall.com. And this has been an amazing discussion. Thank you very much, Professor Tov.
You're welcome. It was really a pleasure for me.
Shalom.
You have been listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemia Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemia's Makor Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiaswall.com.